Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
This week on To the Contrary, first, political violence and its disproportionate impact on women and people of color. Then, the changing perception of women's roles in society. I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from different perspectives. Up first, rising concerns over violence. A series of recent incidents involving the murder of two Minnesotans, including the state House Speaker, the murder of two people leaving a U.S. Capitol event hosted by a Jewish group, and other developments have people asking if we are a politically violent nation. The murder of Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband in their home has renewed alarm over political violence in the U.S. Studies show women and people of color face higher rates of threats and even violence, especially when they hold public office or advocate for social justice. This could be why the intersection of race, gender, and ideology makes civic engagement more hazardous for these groups. With us this week are Republican strategist Ann Stone, Sam Bennett of the New York Amsterdam News, Republican strategist Whitley Yates, and Democratic strategist Na'ilah Amaru. So, Sam Bennett, is political violence worse today?
Absolutely, and I think it's been role modeled from the top and the president that we have.
It's not that violence is worse, although we've had a lot just lately. It's that we know more about it because of social media.
Absolutely, political violence is worse today than it was a decade ago. And I think a part of that has to do with the rise of extremist ideologies. The far right and other extremist groups have really become organized and emboldened, particularly with the election of Trump. And also social media has really made its place in serving as a recruitment tool to make space for more political violence.
I think that the rise of social media platforms have been a sounding board for rhetoric that has had ripples into violence in our political community.
So let's start with who's at risk for greater violence. Is it women or people of color or some subgroup?
As soon as Trump was elected, Pew Research did an exceptional research project that showed that misogyny against women rose 4,300% the day he was elected. This is online misogyny, which I think speaks to all of my colleagues pointing out the role that social media plays. But women are uniquely vulnerable. In fact, AP has just launched a multi-year project because they're finding that their journalists across the world, particularly women, particularly journalists of color, are uniquely vulnerable to this kind of attack.
Well, misogyny doesn't always translate to violence, at least not physical violence, mental violence, yes. But I think if you're talking about a subgroup that is most vulnerable, I think it's all of our elected officials in both sides. And I think more and more they're having to have private security. Our cabinet secretaries have all been targeted. So I think it has become a real problem, and we know more about it because of social media.
Na'ilah, what do you think about women versus people of color? Who's more vulnerable right now and why?
Specifically, women of color are most vulnerable because women of color, particularly elected officials, are very visible manifestations that can be perceived as challenges to traditional power structures. Particularly when women, and people of color, but again, specifically women of color, come from historically marginalized groups. And so as more women of color are elected, they gain visibility, they gain power. There oftentimes is that backlash from those who may feel threatened from those shifting social norms.
We have to be fair and say that the political rhetoric and physical political violence has escalated, not just under Trump. I mean, Trump was assassinated, or there was an assassination, attempt on Trump during Biden's term. And so we've seen this type of violence get carried away and taken out of hand. You go from online to acting out and outbursts of violence against those that are leading in policies, that are leading in political positions. And so while, Na'ilah says that it is women of color, what we've seen is it's just people in positions that are utilizing their platform a lot of times to voice the difference in the status quo, and they're being punished for that.
What about the fact that the media have been saying that President Trump opens up a whole selection of fields of discussion that are now in the public arena that weren't 5 or 10 years ago? How much of this was prompted by him speaking the way he does? Your thoughts, Anne?
It's an easy excuse. But in fact, the rhetoric and the attacks happened under Bush, under Obama. It's been going on for a while. It wasn't so bad under Clinton. There was some. But again, social media does give sort of the trumpet to all this and megaphone, and makes everything worse. And I'll tell you, the assassination attempts, the most visible ones, have been against Trump and a lot of his cohorts. And frankly, there have been elected officials on the Democrat side, as well as people in academia on the Democrat side and elsewhere, that have called for his assassination, which is just outrageous. And nothing the man ever said warranted some of the rhetoric that's been directed at him by all levels: celebrities, academia, elected officials, all saying he should be killed. I mean, unbelievable. That is causing a lot of the violence.
What's the best way for other politicians to respond when he makes comments like this? Is it to sidestep the issue of violence completely?
Well, he's not calling for violence.
No, I'm just saying when he talks about violent incidents, if people are going to respond to that in the public media arena, should they get away from talking about violence or bring it up?
They should be measured and use facts only.
I think in terms of what does that accountability look like in terms of, or responsibilities rather, for other elected officials to speak to what the rhetoric is. I do think it's important to hold peers accountable, right? So when you hear extremist rhetoric coming from within your own party, regardless of party, to be intentional about calling it out, to help avoid, I think, just the amplification of some really dangerous ideologies, which taps into the earlier question of the role of media in shaping, the perception of how people think about political violence. I think, again, media amplification can incite or it can inform, right? And so there's that relationship between, responsive reporting to expose threats that are real and valid and happening, but also to promote accountability, which taps into, again, other political leaders and holding their own accountable.
Whitley, what do you think about, public media, and not public media in the sense of getting funds from the government, but public media, anybody who broadcasts publicly or is online publicly, stoking violence? Do you think that is going on?
That's not new, where people have created spaces for hate to permeate. That has been seen through history for years and years. I think we have to be careful when we say the word violence. Are we talking about someone hurting your feelings and calling you out of your name? Or are we talking about someone showing up to your house and unaliving you? Those are two very different things. And one may say that one incites the other, but there is a clear distinction between having a heated debate with someone and making the decision to then go and be physically violent against them. And I think that that's what we're talking about here. So I don't want to conflate the two. Those that are specifically in American politics today, the more visible you are, the more vulnerable you are, because there are people out there that feel like what you're doing in your position of power is detrimentally impacting them, so much so that they and all of the issues within the mental health of this country are willing to take it out and or to take you out because they don't like your rhetoric or they don't like what you stand for. And that, to me, is a symptom of a greater problem, not just the politics, but the mental health of the people.
What's the proper response in what time we have left? It does seem to be ticking up. I don't know. I don't have data to prove that, but it does seem to be ticking up. And particularly against women and people of color, what should be done to rein it in?
Well, I think we can't underestimate the power. I think we're all alluding to this, all of us as colleagues. Never underestimate the power of pushback. I think if people decry and push back, we found that in our research on a different subject, that the simple act of people stepping forward and saying, no, that's not right, against misogyny against women in politics, it made this huge impact in how voters voted. So I think we can't underestimate the power that each one of us have in society, whether we're in the media like I am or other roles, to stand up and be heard.
But there are senators certainly coming out and saying this is wrong, this has to stop. Nobody's listening.
I think if you build a critical mass where it's not just an isolated voice here and there, but rather everyone in a broad base saying enough, this cannot happen anymore. Now, we don't want to go back to the 60s where assassinations were, deadly assassinations were the norm. But I think we all have a role, each one of us as citizens and people in positions of power or not in power, to push back and say no more. We do not tolerate this. Not okay.
How were officials, if they played a role in it at all, able to curb that trend of violence, and back in the late 60s, early 70s? And could it be used again today?
Well, nobody dared use the kind of rhetoric we're talking here. And we had a much more united country in terms of sources of media and sources of information. So everybody had sort of shared vision from that. The information sources are so disparate now, it's hard to get a more unified message through to the American people. So it'd be interesting to see if Trump and or the Congress and or the Senate, whomever, or the parties would decide to come together and maybe have a common ground meeting and have the media cover it and have them talk about the need to tone down the rhetoric and for people to start looking at what each other is really saying and stop attacking first and start listening first instead. That's something I've advocated for years, but it's harder now because of the disparate sources of information to get this unified message, but we've got to try harder. It can't go the way it is. It can't continue to go the way it is.
I do think that media has shifted, and it has shifted from informing people to engaging people. And usually engaging with rage and having negative bias is what sells and gets clicks, meaning that there's going to be different news for different views. And in order to keep that base, now that attention is currency, the more that you're looking at a specific site or watching their content, the more money that they're making. It's what's channeling a lot of this polarization, specifically in political fields. And I think that if we were able to come back down and have media that informs instead of incites, as Na'ilah was saying earlier, then we would be in a better place. But as long as the model, specifically with social media and the way that content is now created in media and news is this way, then we will not see a change.
What is it that's different today from, let's say, 10 years ago when the internet was already quite busy and quite popular? What has changed? And what impact has that had on the level of actual violence perpetrated by members of the public?
So before, media, advertising, and things of that nature, you used to watch ads. Now the ads watch you, and the ads are tracking your every movement, and the algorithms are creating a world that feeds you exactly what you want to hear and exactly what you want to see. It is you living in a silo of sameness, receiving information that you already agree and align with. At any time you are confronted with something that is different on your algorithm, it a lot of times incites hate because you've been sitting in that silo of sameness. And so what you have created for people are these alternate realities, and their reality is what is on their feed. And so as they're feeding their minds, they're looking, they're reading, and they're consuming, that becomes their then reality. Where before, when the news was more objective and it was in print and people could at least trust, there weren't different news for different views. It was just the truth of what was happening. But now that we have all of these different echo chambers, people are kind of forced to stay in their own corners. And when they're confronted with something that's different, it can cause some cognitive dissonance.
You know, coming from the most influential, oldest continuously published Black newspaper in America, we hold ourselves to the very highest standards of accuracy and truth. So I think what we're finding right now is to what our colleagues are pointing to, this increased polarization caused by that algorithmic narrowization, right, of voice. But I think it is a time where it's important for America to subscribe and listen to those verified news sources that have been there, and even the new ones that can have the highest standard of truth telling. Not all of them can be substantiated, not all of them can be trusted, but many can. And I think that's an important distinction. But I do agree with what you're saying. I do.
Well, Whitley said something very important where she said attention is currency. And in order to overcome that, you're going to have something concerted, organized from the top, and it's going to have to be the White House, the Congress, the Senate, both parties deciding that they want to join together and have some public forums and engage the media and say, listen, guys, you're contributing to this, you're shaping this, you've got to stop. We've got to work together to change the discourse level and to change where this country is going. It has to be concerted.
And we've done that before. We did it before with the FEC hearings way back in the 50s. We're ready to go there again. We need it.
Boy, would I love to be a fly on the wall of that meeting, because you know what? It's never going to take place. It's just too big and a topic with too many signs. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter @BonnieRBay. From dangers and threats to changing views of women. It's not just in party leadership where you see a shift in views. The New York Times reports that in 2022, fewer than 30% of Republican men believed women should return to their traditional roles in society, end quote. 2 years later, that number of Republican men rose to 48%. Republican women changed their views on that topic too. In 2022, only 23% of Republican women agreed that women should return to traditional roles. But 2 years later, that number rose to 37%. Today, 79% of Republican men and 67% of Republican women say they believe American society has gotten, quote, too soft and feminine, end quote. These trends emerge while gender attitudes are also shifting politically and culturally, with a rising backlash against women's rights. So, Anne, again, what do we do with this, and how do we curb reaction so it doesn't provoke violence or, for that matter, even anger?
Well, a big part of that is driven by the fact people are kind of freaked out by the declining birth rate now. And there is more discussion of having to have, more cooperation, so to speak, between men and women to sort of raise the birth rate. So that's driving part of it, where they're starting to look at more traditional roles. But the rest of it isn't so much that they think women should be back in the kitchen per se, but the pendulum swung from being all, male chauvinism to being almost extreme female chauvinism. I happen to be a female chauvinist, even though I'm a Republican. And now the pendulum is, going to swing back a little bit more towards the middle. Not all of this is bad, as long as women are not denied access to, equal ability to work or do whatever. But they should have the right to make a choice within a wide range of options. But the declining birth rate is part of what is driving that perception.
If we're going to refuse to censor media, and that could be anything from TikTok to Chit Chat to whatever platform you want to use. But if we're not going to do that, how do we possibly get a handle on all the violence that's become the fabric of international conversation?
Well, I'm going to say this, and you're going to say, here she goes again. But I truly believe the teaching of women's history helps all this. It certainly helps create a greater partnership between men and women. I think it does change the fabric of society. I've told you before, when I give speeches before men and women, adult men and women, about women's history, the men come up and say, oh my God, I could never look at a woman the same way again. Those with daughters come up and say, oh my God, my daughter's life is going to be so much better now. But men are really moved by finding out that it wasn't just a disparate woman here or there, but in fact, throughout history, there were thousands and thousands of women, sometimes alone, sometimes in partnership with men, that really helped achieve some of the greatest things in society, and those stories have been hidden. But when they're revealed, men do react well. All of that has a ripple effect, and I know it'll affect things like domestic violence, and overall, I think it will have an effect on violence because of the way we'll start to look at each other maybe more as partners instead of enemies.
Yeah, I think that this issue has been framed incorrectly, and it's usually progress versus tradition when it should be agency versus expectation. And I'm pretty passionate about this. Whether a woman wants to lead a Fortune 500 company and run the entire world, or she wants to stay home and take care of her kids, it's her decision to make. And I think that the pressure that society places on women to choose either one or the other is limiting, and it doesn't give the women the freedom that they truly deserve. So it doesn't matter whether or not they choose to stay at home, have children, take care of the household, or raise their husband, or they want to be boss babes, never have any children, and run companies. It's her decision. And when we as a society realize that and give women the freedom to be whatever it is that they so desire, I think that we'll have a better, more equilibrium community.
It's been going on now for some 3 or more decades that women should not be held back by any laws that favor men in the workplace. They should be given the same freedoms. They should be hired and fired for the same reasons. And still, I mean, there's been some progress, certainly, but we're not anywhere near the point where men and women are almost equal. So what's keeping us from that final goal?
I think about this in 2 ways, right? So one, I think the most common framing is the masculinity crisis, right? Through the political lens and also through media rhetoric, it increasingly, I think, frames gender inclusivity, women's empowerment, pick your buzzword, as a threat, right, to traditional concepts and practices of masculinity and how that translates to perception of national strength, which is really important, again, to the point that was raised earlier about this perception of American society being too soft and feminine, as if those are inherently weak characteristics. The other thing that has been interesting, I think, just to kind of recognize is that the more that we have inclusion of different identities through the lens of feminism or the LGBTQ plus movement, the more inclusive that we are of diverse identities are oftentimes misinterpreted as a loss, right? As a loss of weakness, particularly by, again, the traditional norm of, rugged masculinity, I think is a really important point to consider in this conversation.
How should this all be thrown out there? And in a way that will lead to constructive discussion, not criticism of the individual making the point.
Well, I guess I would again go back and say women's history. I know, again, sound like Johnny One Note here or Jill One Note. The point is, men have been beaten for 30 years to say, you've got to accept women, women are as good, women are as good. And you can make them do it through laws and through cultural pressure. But are they thinking it? And the way you affect their thinking is to make them uncomfortable in what they know about women. And again, the stories of real women of accomplishment do that. When they find out women were the ones that developed nuclear fission, the ones that developed all sorts of things that, run airplanes and developed a technology that allows cell phones, etc. When they learn those things, their mind changes, and then accepting women becomes easier for them.
And I think Anne's 100% correct on this one, Bonnie. But I also think it's very easy to think that the natural expansion of civil rights, including women, right, is a natural, organic, to be relied on thing. That nothing could be further from the truth. Just think of this. To the contrary, this wonderful show was founded in 1992, the year of the woman, when we all thought we had it all made. We had a historic number of women that got elected, and the world was going to be a wonderful place. And what did we find? We plateaued, and now we find ourselves sliding back. And each decade has a challenge. My daughters have a challenge. My granddaughter has a challenge in front of her to make sure that we're unwavering, to make sure that women's rights continues to advance. But I couldn't agree with Anne more in the context of what women have contributed to our society from the very beginning, including the founding fathers, which I can guarantee you there are some founding mothers nobody talks about.
Yes, there are.
Well, your thoughts on the best way to rein this in peacefully as opposed to sparking more calls for violence?
Well, I think it's a combination of a cultural shift and a political shift, right? So there's that framing of does policy reinforce culture, or does culture lead to shifts in policy, which has, again, another impact on, again, like our broader frameworks and ideologies that we all live under, regardless of our identities. So, the role of media, again, also I think helps drive that political belief. Folks who have high follower counts, conversations that we have online, shapes how people understand, the role and impact of masculinity and femininity and women's equality, and how we perceive that as society, and how we perceive that as whether that's beneficial to ourselves, or if that is potentially taking away something from ourselves or our family. So I think it's a combination of both cultural and political shift, which can be a really messy process.
And one last thing I'd like to note, which is accounting for the number of mentally unstable people who are out there in the population. And before the entree of media going into everybody's computer, I mean, you don't even need a TV set or a pair of antennas. You just need to be able to get to sites where there are public discussions of various things. And you don't know who is reading what you're saying and how they will be inflamed by it. So it's, a good idea to keep that in mind too. That's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Keep the conversation going on our social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok. Reach out to us at To the Contrary and visit our website. The address is on the screen. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
You're watching PBS.